I woke up to sunlight filtering through the heavy curtains in my room. My heart was heavy, a feeling I couldn't shake. I got out of bed and, as I looked in the mirror, I saw the reflection of a young woman who seemed to have no idea what was coming. Claire Anderson, the heiress of one of the largest technology companies in the United States, was about to face the most devastating loss of her life, the death of my father. The phone rang, cutting through the stillness of the morning. When I answered, the family lawyer's voice sounded serious and full of regret. "Claire, I'm so sorry. Your father passed away this morning." The world around me fell apart. The words echoed in my mind, but I couldn't process them. I always knew the day would come, but reality was much crueler than I imagined. My father was not just a man. He was the compass that guided my life, my mentor, and my friend. Now all that was left was a legacy that I barely understood. Over the next few days, the house filled with people who seemed more interested in the inheritance than in offering me comfort. I felt that, somehow, they were waiting for me, at 25, to take control of the company. But how? I barely knew how the machinery worked behind those imposing walls of Anderson Tech headquarters. The meetings, the numbers, the people, it all seemed like a maze with no way out. Sitting in my office, surrounded by memories and documents, an idea began to germinate. What if I could see the company from a different perspective? I thought. That's when the idea of disguising myself as a driver came up. I needed to understand the business, the people, the dynamics that shaped the company. It would be a way of learning, of listening without being heard, of observing without being observed. A way to connect with those who really made the company work. Kathy. That would be my name. A common name that would allow me to go unnoticed. I imagined myself driving through the city's busy streets, taking executives to their meetings, listening to their conversations, absorbing what they really thought about the company and about me. With this new perspective, I hoped to discover not only how the company operated, but also how people felt about this world I inherited. The day of my first race arrived. Nervousness consumed me as I looked at myself once again in the mirror. "You can do it, Kathy. It's just a temporary job," I muttered to myself. I took the car, a simple model that didn't attract attention, and drove to the meeting point. As soon as my first client, Mark Reynolds, got into the car, I felt butterflies in my stomach. He was one of the company's most ambitious executives, and I knew his ego was as big as his position. "Hello, Kathy. Let's get straight to the point, shall we?" he said, straightening his suit and looking at me in the rearview mirror. His voice was authoritative, and he wasted no time in starting to talk about the company's new strategy. "These employees don't understand what hard work is. If only they were as dedicated as we are, the company would be much better off." I felt a lump in my throat. "Yeah, they have their own challenges," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Challenges? Please. They need discipline, a leader who makes them work. If you're not capable of that, you don't deserve to be here," he retorted, arrogance permeating every word. As I drove, my heart filled with indignation. How could someone be so insensitive? I knew that my father valued every employee, every person who contributed to the company's success. And there was Mark, belittling the hard work of so many just to feed his ego. That conversation made me realize that I wasn't just inheriting a company. I had a responsibility to the people who worked there. The weight of heritage became clearer by the minute, and I knew that to honor my father's memory, I would need to be different. This journey as a driver was just beginning, but I already felt like I was about to discover much more about myself than about the company. I was behind the wheel, adrenaline pumping through my veins as I drove through the city's busy streets. The smell of the car's interior mixed with the feeling of newness, a mix of insecurity and determination. The name Kathy sounded more comfortable in my ears than Claire. I needed to distance myself from the heiress I was and become the driver I intended to be, even if just for a few hours. The car glided along the avenues, and the silence between Mark Reynolds and me was palpable. He was absorbed in his thoughts, his eyes fixed on his cell phone screen. But in a moment of distraction, he looked at me and dismissively said, "Could you speed up a little? I have an important meeting and I can't be late." I don't know how you drivers can be so slow. I took a deep breath, holding back the urge to retort. "Of course, sir. I'll increase the speed," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. The truth was that I wanted to know more about him, about how he saw the world. He didn't disappoint me. As soon as I refocused on the road, he started talking, his words dripping like venom. "You don't know how difficult it is to deal with these employees. They think they have rights just because they work hard. In fact, they should be grateful to have a job. What they don't realize is that the company doesn't need them, and that if they're not good, they can simply be replaced," he said, laughing arrogantly. With each word, my heart sank. I thought about my father, how he always talked about the importance of each team member, from the simplest to the highest executives. "But sir, don't you think everyone has a role to play? Without employees, the company wouldn't be able to function," I tried to argue. He gave me a disdainful look. "You're just a driver, Kathy. You don't understand how the world really works. The power lies with those who make the decisions, not those who execute them. And those who don't understand that don't last long at the company." His arrogance was enough to make anyone indignant, but what bothered me most was the idea that he thought that way about people who dedicated their lives to work. As I was driving, an emergency call interrupted my thoughts. The name on my cell phone screen was familiar, Mr. Thompson, an important client. "Kathy, is that you?" His voice was thick with frustration. "I'm trying to communicate with the team, but no one is responding to me. This is unacceptable. The company is becoming chaos. I'm sorry for your experience, Mr. Thompson. What can I do to help?" I asked, trying to remain calm. He sighed heavily. "I need you to take this message to those who can really do something. The lack of communication is affecting our projects. It's not possible for things to work like this." As soon as the call ended, I felt overwhelmed. Mr. Thompson's frustration was yet another sign of the disconnect that existed within the company. It was as if Mark was living in a parallel universe, where empathy and collaboration were unknown words. As I drove, I realized that what I was really doing was much more than just understanding how the company works. I was collecting stories, experiences, and emotions from people who, like me, wanted to be heard. At the end of the day, when I finally parked the car, a wave of reflection invaded me. I looked out the window and saw the city lighting up as night fell. The contrast between life on the streets and the coldness of the corporate world was becoming increasingly clear to me. Kathy was turning into something more than a mere disguise. It was a bridge between me and the truths I needed to discover. I knew that by going undercover, I was not only making myself invisible, but also giving a voice to those who were often ignored. The day had been a test of character and, more importantly, a test of humility. If I really wanted to lead my father's company in the way he always dreamed of, I would need to understand and value everyone who made it up. And so, as I walked home, determination grew within me. I was just beginning to understand the true meaning of leadership. It was a sunny morning, and I felt more confident getting behind the wheel again. Like Kathy, the anonymous driver, I was determined to better understand the culture of the company that was now mine. My heart was racing with the expectation of new discoveries. Soon, my next passenger arrived, Lisa, the marketing director. Contrary to what I expected, she was warm and approachable. I felt relieved to see her smile as she got into the car. "Hi, Kathy. How are you today?" she asked, with a sparkle in her eyes. I am well, thanks. And you? I replied, trying to keep the conversation light while driving. A typical day at work. You know how it goes. But I'm excited for the meeting with the sales team. They have some amazing ideas, she said, looking out the window as the traffic moved slowly. The conversation flowed naturally, and I felt at ease. Lisa was talking about her marketing strategies, and for the first time, I saw someone in leadership who actually seemed to care about people. I believe that our internal communication needs to improve. We need everyone to feel part of the team, you know, she commented, and I couldn't help but agree. But then, as I was driving, a scene I would never forget unfolded in front of me. An executive, who I couldn't identify, was facing a sales team employee, a young man named Daniel. You can't just do whatever you want. This is unacceptable, the executive shouted, with a tone of voice that made Daniel's heart feel like a drum. I couldn't help it. Sorry, but that's not necessary, I commented out loud, even though I knew they couldn't hear me. The young man seemed to crumble under the pressure, and the way the executive treated him outraged me. As soon as the scene ended and the executive left, silence took over the car. Lisa noticed my worried expression. Did you see what happened to Daniel? She asked, with a look of sadness. Yes, and I can't understand how anyone could treat another person like that. This shouldn't happen in a work environment, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Unfortunately, it is more common than we would like to admit. I always try to defend the team, but many of the executives seem to have lost empathy, Lisa responded, and I realized that despite her upbeat tone, she was also carrying the weight of the toxic culture that permeated the company. The journey continued, and with every word exchanged, I felt like I was on an emotional battlefield. Lisa was a leader who cared, but she was surrounded by those who only sought results at any cost. When we finally arrived at our destination, I left her at the entrance of the building. Thank you, Kathy. It was a pleasure talking to you. We really appreciate the work you do, she said, getting out of the car with a sincere smile. As I drove home, a whirlwind of thoughts invaded my mind. I needed to do something. I needed to understand more about this culture that allowed humiliation and lack of respect. Upon entering the house, I found Sarah in the living room, and I didn't hesitate to share everything I had witnessed. Sarah, you won't believe what I saw today. The company culture is much more toxic than I imagined. I began, and she looked at me with concern. What happened, Claire? She asked, leaning forward, interested. I saw an executive humiliating an employee. And the saddest thing is that Lisa, who is a great person, can't change this alone, I said, feeling the indignation rising inside me. This is horrible. You need to do something, Claire. You are in a position to change that now, she replied, with a twinkle in her eye. I know, and I want to. But how? I'm just disguised as a driver, I said, frustration showing in my voice. You need to use this to your advantage. You have a unique vision that no one else has. This could be your opportunity, Sarah suggested, and her words began to echo in my mind. I looked out the window, thinking about how every person in the company, even those who seemed cold, had a story and a role to play. It was time for me to discover how these stories intertwined and, more importantly, how I could be the change I so wanted to see. The day dawned cloudy, and a light rain made small spots on the window of my apartment. It was the kind of weather that made me introspective, and for a moment I thought maybe it was a sign of things to come. I woke up with the feeling that something important was about to happen. With a hot cup of coffee in hand, I quickly reviewed the day's agenda. I was scheduled to head a group of investors, and although nervous, anticipation pulsed inside me. I arrived at the meeting point with a mix of anxiety and determination. As soon as the investors got into the car, my mind started working. The group was made up of 5 men, all with an air of power and ambition. The most prominent one, who introduced himself as Mr. Johnson, started talking as soon as he got into the back seat. "Let's be blunt, Kathy. What we need to know is whether your company is prepared to generate profits. We are here to do business, not to hear emotional stories about values and culture," he said, with a clipped tone. The other investors nodded in agreement, and the atmosphere in the car seemed dense. What I wanted most was to call them out on their lack of consideration for employee well-being, but instead I kept my mouth shut and just drove on. The city passed by the windows, but I was lost in my thoughts, wondering how I could use this opportunity to better understand their mentality. During the journey, some comments arose among investors, and the conversation revolved around expected profits. "If we're not seeing at least 30% growth in the next quarter, we can't stay. Simple as that," said Mr. Thompson, his gaze fixed on his cell phone screen, as if it were an oracle that could predict the future. "What about the employees?" I thought. "What about the people who make this company work?" But instead of expressing this, I chose to maintain my listening position. Deep down, I knew this was a chance to observe the true priorities of those who would invest in the company I had inherited. It was then that Mr. Harris, one of the investors who had remained quieter, began to stand out. He intervened in the conversation and, with a calm tone, said, "But what if the company focused on creating a work environment that values its employees? Investment in people often results in long-term, sustainable growth. Happy employees are more productive." I felt relief upon hearing his words. It was as if he brought a cool breeze to that suffocating environment. Finally, someone who understands the importance of human capital, I thought to myself. Mr. Johnson didn't look too happy about the interruption and rolled his eyes, but there was something admirable about the way Mr. Harris stood firm in his convictions. As the trip continued, I observed their interactions. What bothered me most was the apparent lack of empathy, as if employees were just numbers on a report. I imagined how different it would be if I could get them to see the faces behind the statistics, the stories of each contributor. The humiliation I witnessed last week kept coming back to me, and the idea that workers' well-being could be a valuable asset became increasingly clear. At the end of the race, when we arrived at our destination, Mr. Harris turned to me and said, "Kathy, you are an exceptional driver. I hope you also have the opportunity to suggest some ideas on how we can improve company culture." I felt my heart accelerate. He saw me as more than just a driver, and that gave me hope. With a genuine smile, I replied, "I appreciate it, Mr. Harris. For me, it is essential that the company creates an environment that values all its employees. I would like to share some thoughts on this." As I left investors, a wave of determination washed over me. I couldn't let this unique opportunity slip away. The idea of planning a meeting to discuss changes to the company culture began to take shape in my mind. After all, if I wanted to honor my father's memory and transform the company into a place where everyone felt valued, I needed to act. As I drove home, the weight of the responsibilities and revelations I had witnessed weighed heavily on me, but at the same time, a spark of hope lit in my heart. I was determined to transform the company and, more importantly, myself. When I woke up that morning, a mix of anxiety and determination pulsed in my chest. The decision to reveal my identity to Lisa wasn't an easy one, but it felt like the necessary step to usher in a new era at my father's company. Over the weeks, she had shown herself to be one of the few there willing to listen, understand, and, most importantly, act. With a cup of coffee in one hand and the other gripping the steering wheel, I took a deep breath and prepared myself for what was to come. As soon as I arrived at the office, I called Lisa, asking her to meet me in the parking lot. The sun was shining brightly, almost as a sign that it was time to bring some light to the darkness that enveloped the company's leadership. When I saw her, her smile was encouraging, but her eyes betrayed a burning curiosity. Kathy, what's going on? She asked, leaning forward slightly, as if she were about to discover a valuable secret. Lisa, I need to be honest with you. My voice was shaking a little, but I managed to remain firm. I'm not just a driver. My name is Claire Anderson, and I am the new heir to Anderson Tech. Lisa's eyes widened, and for a moment, I could almost hear silence settle around us. She shook her head, putting her hand over her mouth, as if trying to contain her surprise. Claire, this is incredible. His voice was an admiring whisper. You really had the courage to do that. But why, exactly? Because I want to understand the company. I want to know what really happens here, how people feel. And most of all, I want to make changes. I looked into his eyes, trying to convey the sincerity of my words. Would you help me? Lisa smiled, and a gleam of determination lit her eyes. Of course. Let's go together. You are not alone in this. The atmosphere of camaraderie that emerged between us encouraged me. Over the days, Lisa's presence became an invaluable support. As we entered the meeting room full of executives, I was still undercover, but my confidence in myself grew with each step. Good morning, everybody. I began, forcing a smile as I looked at each of the faces present. Today, I would like to raise some questions about our company's culture and values. There was a murmur of surprise. The curious looks, some of them disdainful, made me feel a pulsating adrenaline rush. I knew I had to be incisive. I have heard some concerns from employees about the lack of communication and support. What do you have to say about this? I asked, fixing my gaze on Mark, who leaned back in his chair with an arrogant smile. Look, Kathy, this is just a matter of productivity. People need to understand that we are here for results, he replied, with a disdain that irritated me. His lack of empathy was clear, and I couldn't let it go. But what about the well-being of our employees? Don't you think a more inclusive culture could translate into greater productivity? I insisted, challenging him. The atmosphere in the room became tense. Mark frowned, and I could tell he wasn't used to being questioned like that. Other executives began whispering among themselves, and I could feel the weight of expectation in the air. After the meeting, Mark pulled me aside, his gaze menacing. Listen, Kathy, or rather, Claire. I know your little secret. If you don't behave as I expect, I will expose you. His voice was low, but full of venom. I felt a chill down my spine. The tension between us was palpable, and what had once been a simple conversation had turned into a dangerous game. With controlled breathing, I replied, You can try, Mark. But know that I'm not here to intimidate you. The truth always finds a way to surface. He smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Careful, Claire. The business world can be very treacherous. I left that conversation wondering how I got there. What I thought would be a learning experience about the company turned into a battlefield, and I was determined to fight for the change I wanted to see. The game had begun, and now I was more ready than ever to face the challenges that lay ahead. The gala was more than just a celebration. It was the company's showcase, a show that brought together the biggest names in the technology sector. The room was stunning, adorned with twinkling lights and exotic flowers, while soft music filled the air. I was nervous but determined. In the elegant dress I chose, I felt like a strange mix of Claire and Kathy, the driver who ventured into a world full of illusions and raw truths. The atmosphere was electric when I entered, most of the guests already immersed in lively conversation. My eyes searched for Mark, and there he was, surrounded by a group of executives, all laughing and exchanging ideas about market strategies. A cocky smile adorned his face, and I knew it was the right time to act. With a deep sigh, I prepared myself for the revelation that would change everything. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could give me a moment of your attention, I would like to share something important. I began, my voice firm, cutting through the murmur of the room. Heads turned to me, and I saw the look of surprise on Mark's face. A small smile appeared on my lips. My name is Claire Anderson, and I am the new CEO of Anderson Tech. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Some faces turned pale, while others seemed to be amused by the revelation. Mark stepped forward, his expression now a combination of shock and anger. You can't be serious, Claire. This is a trick, right? We all know you have no idea what it's like to lead a company. Actually, Mark, I've learned a lot over the last few months, I replied, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I've been listening, observing, and most importantly, learning from the people who really make this company work. And you, as one of the longest-serving leaders, should know that success is not built on numbers alone, but on respect and integrity. The room was in an uproar now, and I could feel the looks of disapproval from some collaborators, while others showed silent support. You can't just come here and change everything, he insisted, the threatening tone returning. Things work a certain way, and you're not ready for that. Actually, Mark, you underestimate me. And most importantly, it underestimates the power of a united and respectful team. The courage I had cultivated during my racing as a driver now filled me. And by the way, I can assure you that you're not the only one who has secrets. With those words, I looked across the room to where Mr. Harris was. He looked at me with an encouraging nod. Mr. Harris, could you join me, please? I called. As he approached, the tension increased. Mr. Harris was one of our best employees, unfairly fired by Mark. He has insight that could benefit our company, and it's time to bring the truth to light. Mark became visibly uneasy as the murmur in the room increased. This is absurd. Mr. Harris has no credibility whatsoever, he shouted, trying to reverse the situation. Credibility? What is credibility to you, Mark? I said, without hesitation. You who only care about maintaining appearance and position, while people like Mr. Harris are cast aside for your selfish decisions. The atmosphere was tense, and I could feel the room was divided. Some people spoke out in support, while others were skeptical. But I wasn't willing to back down. This is a new beginning for Anderson Tech. We need leaders who care about people, who value hard work, and who strive for integrity. And that starts now. The room was silent, and I could feel the change in the air. The truth was being revealed, and from that moment on, the company's leadership would begin to redefine itself. With courage pouring out of every word, I knew the journey was just beginning, but I was ready to face it.